You're my first. Evelyn Carter whispered those 3 words the moment Dylan McCall opened his door. Then her face went crimson, and she looked away so fast, her hat nearly fell off. She didn't finish the sentence. Couldn't. Her 4-year-old son tugged her skirt and asked why the man looked angry. Dylan wasn't angry. He was something far more dangerous than angry. He was listening. And in 10 years of living alone, nobody had started a sentence he actually wanted to hear the end of. If this story already has you hooked, subscribe to our channel and follow every part to the end and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The wagon rolled away before Evelyn could change her mind. That was the thing about making a decision with your last dollar. There was no changing your mind afterward. The wagon driver had already taken his fee, already clicked his tongue at his horses, already disappeared around the bend of a road so dry and cracked it looked like the earth itself had given up. She stood there with a worn suitcase that had lost one of its leather clasps, somewhere between San Antonio and here, a 4-year-old boy clinging to her left hand, and the address of a man she had never met, written on a folded letter she had read so many times. The creases had turned soft. Dylan McCall, cattle rancher, widower. Answers correspondence slowly, but answers it honestly. That last part was what had convinced her. Honesty she could work with. Anything else she already knew how to survive. Samuel pressed against her leg. "Mama, is this where we live now?" She looked down at him. His hair was sticking up on one side from sleeping against her shoulder on the wagon, and he had a smear of dried peach on his chin from the piece of fruit the driver's wife had given him at the last stop, and he was looking up at her with those dark eyes that trusted her completely, which was the most terrifying thing in the world to be on the receiving end of when you were this uncertain. "We're going to find out," she said. The ranch house was not what she had imagined. She had imagined without meaning to something weathered but tended. Something that showed a man's effort, even if it didn't show his prosperity. What she found was a structure that had clearly once been cared for, and had since been informed by the man living inside it that caring was no longer on the agenda. The fence posts along the front were straight, but the cross rails between them sagged. The porch boards were solid underfoot, but unswept. The window glass was clean. She noticed that immediately. Clean glass. He kept the glass clean, but the curtains behind them hung crooked. One panel longer than the other. The kind of thing a woman fixes without thinking, and a man alone stops seeing after the first year. She knocked. The silence that followed was long enough to make her wonder if he was home, and then long enough to make her wonder if she had the wrong address, and then the door opened and Dylan McCall was standing in front of her, and every mental preparation she had made for this moment walked quietly out the back of her mind. He was taller than she'd expected, broad through the shoulders in a way that had nothing to do with trying, and everything to do with years of physical work. His face was the kind of face that had been through something not just weathered by sun and wind, which it had been, but marked by something interior. Something that had moved through him and left its evidence in the set of his jaw and the careful stillness of his eyes. He was not unkind-looking. He was not warm-looking. He was looking at her the way a man looks at something he doesn't entirely know what to do with. And she opened her mouth and said the worst possible thing. "You're my first." The words were out before she understood what she was saying. She had meant she had been thinking on the wagon about how to explain herself when he opened the door, and she had been rehearsing something about how she had never done this before, never answered a correspondence, notice never shown up at a stranger's property, with a suitcase and a child, and nothing but a letter she had been rehearsing. That, and instead what came out was 3 words that landed between them, like something dropped from a great height. Her face went so hot, she felt it in her ears. "I meant, this is my first time responding to a..." She stopped, pressed her lips together, started again with the small shred of dignity she had left. "I've never answered a correspondence notice before, sir." Dylan McCall looked at her for a moment that lasted considerably longer than was comfortable. Then he looked down at Samuel, who looked back at him with the frank, assessing gaze that only very young children and very old men can produce without apology. "You look angry," Samuel said. "Samuel." "I'm not angry," Dylan said. His voice was low and even, the kind of voice that didn't waste motion. "I'm thinking." "About what?" Samuel asked. A pause. Whether to put the coffee on. He stepped back from the door. Not an invitation exactly, more like an absence of obstacle. Evelyn picked up her suitcase and walked inside before she could think about it too hard, because thinking too hard was how she had stayed in places she should have left, and she was done with that. The kitchen was the room that told her the most about him. It was functional with a precision that felt almost aggressive. Every tool had a place. The cast iron hung in size order. The dry goods were in labeled tins, the labels written in a hand that was careful and deliberate, the kind of handwriting that belonged to a man who did not do anything carelessly. But there was only one of everything. One cup on the drying rack. One plate. One chair pulled up close to the table, and two others pushed back against the wall where they wouldn't be needed. One person had been living here, and had not been expecting that to change. Evelyn set her suitcase down near the door, not too far inside, not presumptuous, and Samuel immediately found a wooden crate near the hearth, and climbed on top of it, and sat there surveying the room, with the proprietary satisfaction of a child who has decided a space belongs to him. Dylan poured 2 cups of coffee, and set them on the table, and then stood with his back against the counter, and his arms crossed, which was not hostile exactly, but was definitely not relaxed. "The letter said you have experience with accounts," he said. "Yes." "And horses?" "I was raised on a working property until I was 16. After that I kept books for a dry goods merchant in San Antonio for 4 years. "What happened at 16? The question was blunt. She'd been expecting it sooner or later, and had decided she would answer it directly because people who danced around direct questions made her tired. "My father's property failed in a drought. He sold what he could and moved us to the city. He passed 2 years later." She wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. It was good coffee, strong, and not bitter. "The merchant I worked for closed his business last year when his son took over and decided he didn't need a woman keeping his books. I had savings enough to get here. Not much beyond that." Dylan was quiet for a moment. "The boy's father. Not in the picture. By his choice or yours?" She met his eyes. "Mine." Something shifted in his expression, not much, just a small recalibration, like a man adjusting his weight when the ground isn't what he expected. "The correspondence notice said room board and a wage for ranch management assistance," she said. "I'm here to work Mr. McCall. I'm not here to be a burden, and I'm not here to cause complications. I want a stable place for my son, and I'm willing to earn it honestly." "I know," he said. "That's why I wrote back." She hadn't expected that, the directness of it. She had expected negotiation skepticism, some kind of probationary posturing. Not, "I know." Not that quiet, flat acknowledgement that carried underneath it something that felt improbably like respect. Samuel climbed down from the crate and walked to the center of the room and looked up at Dylan. "Do you have any animals?" he asked. "Several." "What kind?" "Cattle. Horses. A dog with no manners." Samuel's eyes lit. "Can I see the dog?" Dylan looked at Evelyn. She shrugged slightly, which she realized was already a form of shorthand between them, which was strange given that they had known each other for less than 15 minutes. He unfolded his arms and moved toward the back door. "Come on then," he said. Samuel ran after him without a backward glance, and Evelyn stood alone in the kitchen with her coffee and the quiet understanding that something had just begun that she could not entirely control. The first week was careful. That was the word for it. Careful. Like two people moving through the same house with their elbows tucked in, making themselves small in the spaces the other person occupied, speaking only when speech was necessary. Agreeing on logistics with a minimum of actual conversation. Dylan was up before the sun. She heard his boots on the floorboards, not heavy but deliberate. Heard the back door. Heard the silence that followed, which was the silence of a man who'd learned to be alone with himself and had made a certain peace with it. She gave him 20 minutes before she started breakfast. Not because they'd arranged it that way, but because 20 minutes felt like the right margin of privacy to leave a person. He ate without ceremony, thanked her without flourish, asked about Samuel with a single practical question. Each morning the boy sleep all right, the boy eating enough, and then went to work. But he left the accounts ledger on the kitchen table the third morning, and that told her something. She opened it that afternoon while Samuel napped. The numbers were meticulous. He was not careless with money, not vague about his own operation. But there were places where the recording method was losing him efficiency. Places where a different organizational approach would save him hours of calculation. She didn't touch it. She made notes on a separate page. That evening she set the notes beside the ledger and said nothing. He picked them up after supper, read them standing up, which she had noticed he preferred to sitting, said nothing for a long moment. "You trained as an accountant." "Self-taught mostly. The merchant I worked for gave me books and I read them." "This would save time." "Most weeks, yes." He set the notes down and looked at her with that measuring look she was beginning to understand was simply how he processed things. Not suspicion, not challenge, just the look of a man who had learned not to take anything at face value and wasn't ashamed of it. "Implement it," he said. "If it works, I want to know." She nodded. He went to bed. She sat at the kitchen table for another hour implementing it, and she felt for the first time in longer than she wanted to count like herself. On the 9th day, the horse problem started. Dylan had 4 horses for the ranch work, and 1 mare that he clearly kept separate from the working stock. A pale gray animal with a scar along her left flank, who stood in the far corner of the paddock and watched people approach with the evaluating stillness of someone who has been surprised badly before and is not going to let it happen again. Evelyn had noticed the mare on the first day. Had noticed also that Dylan's face changed when he walked past the paddock. Not softened exactly, but something in it that was quieter, more internal. She didn't ask about it. But on the 9th morning, she came out to find Samuel standing at the paddock fence, with his arms stretched through the rails, his small fingers extended, and the gray mare 3 feet away from him, with her head lowered, considering. Her heart stopped. She walked, not ran running startled horses, and she didn't want to spook the animal. She walked to the fence at a pace that felt physically painful to maintain, and said very quietly, "Samuel, come here." "She came to me, Mama." "I see that. Come here now." "But she—" "Samuel." He turned and came to her with the aggrieved compliance of a child who knows he's not actually in trouble, but is being treated as though he is. She pulled him back from the fence. Her hands were shaking. Dylan was behind her. She hadn't heard him come up. "He's not hurt," Dylan said. "I know." She kept her voice level. "I'm sorry. I should have told him to stay away from the paddock." She didn't threaten him. Evelyn turned. "What?" "Rosie." Dylan was looking at the mare who had retreated back to her corner, but was still watching Samuel with that same careful attention. "She doesn't let people close. She hasn't in 3 years. He paused. She came to him. Something in the way he said it made Evelyn look at him more carefully. His face was doing the quieter, more internal thing. "What happened to her?" she asked before she could decide not to. A beat. Same thing that happens to anyone who trusted the wrong person. He turned and walked back toward the barn. "Keep an eye on him around the other 3. They're working horses less predictable." She watched him go, and then she turned back to the paddock, and Rosie was still watching Samuel, and Samuel was watching Rosie, and some recognition was passing between them that she couldn't name but understood completely. 12 days in, she found the letter. It wasn't hidden. It was in the account ledger tucked between 2 pages. She was reorganizing a single sheet, folded twice the handwriting on the outside, faded enough that it must have been folded and unfolded many times. She didn't read it. She set it on the table beside the ledger and went back to her work. When Dylan came in for supper and saw it, he stopped. The stillness that came over him was different from his usual stillness. This was the stillness of a man who has encountered something he had put away and is deciding in the moment whether to put it away again. It fell out of the ledger. Evelyn said without looking up. I put it aside. He picked it up, stood holding it for a moment, put it in his shirt pocket. She didn't ask. He sat down and ate supper, and then he said, not looking at her, My wife passed 4 years ago. She didn't say she was sorry. She'd learned that some people don't want sorry. They want to be heard saying what they're saying. How long were you married? 6 years. She kept the accounts. A pause that told her she'd read it right. Yes. Evelyn set down her fork. I can use a different system if the one I've been using was hers. He looked up at her then. That measuring look, but underneath it, something she hadn't seen there before. Something that looked improbably like surprise. The system you put in is better, he said. I know, she said. I'm asking anyway. He was quiet for a long time. Keep your system? He said finally. She would have done the same thing if she'd thought of it. He said it as though it were a plain fact. She received it as one, and they finished supper in a silence that was for the first time comfortable. On the 15th morning, the Hargrove men rode in. There were 3 of them. They came during the hour when Dylan was out with the cattle and Evelyn was alone with Samuel, and they tied their horses at the front fence and came to the porch without invitation, and stood there with the particular arrangement of men who have decided they have the right to be wherever they want to be. The one in front was broad and unhurried, the kind of man who'd learned that taking his time communicated power. He had a land company card in his hand. We're looking for McCall, he said. He's not here, Evelyn said. When's he back? I don't know. The man looked at her with the slow assessment of someone who doesn't believe what he's hearing and wants her to know it. You his wife. I'm ranch staff. A pause. The man on the left, younger with restless eyes, looked past her into the house, and she moved slightly to stand more squarely in the doorway. Tell McCall that Hargrove Land is making a formal offer on the eastern quarter this week, the man in front said. It'd be in his interest to hear it. I'll tell him. It'd also be in his interest, the man said, his voice dropping just slightly, not quite a threat, but angled toward one, not to take too long making up his mind. Droughtland doesn't improve with waiting. Evelyn looked at him steadily. I'll make sure he knows you feel that way. The 3 men looked at each other. The man in front smiled the kind of smile that wasn't warm, and tipped his hat once, and they untied their horses and rode back down the road. Samuel appeared at her elbow. Who were they? Business people, she said. They weren't nice. No, she agreed. They weren't. When Dylan came in at midday, and she told him, his face went very still, in a way that was entirely different from his usual stillness. This was the stillness before something. Hargrove, he said. You know them. It wasn't a question. He pulled out the chair and sat down, which he rarely did in the middle of the day. They've been buying up failed drought properties for 2 years, he said. The eastern quarter is the only piece of my land that abuts their holdings. They want it to consolidate a corridor. He put his hands flat on the table. I've told them no 3 times. They said formal offer this week. A formal offer from Hargrove is 1 step before formal pressure. He looked up at her. They don't take no for territory they want. Something tightened in Evelyn's chest that was not quite fear and not quite anger. What kind of pressure? He held her gaze for a moment. The kind that makes life complicated. Then we need to make sure your holdings documentation is airtight, she said. Water rights boundary surveys, tax records. If they're going to push legally, you need everything in perfect order. He stared at her. I'll start this afternoon, she said. A long silence. Then, you don't have to. I know I don't have to. She stood and moved toward the account ledger on the shelf. But you said implement it if it works. This is part of the same thing. She pulled the ledger down and set it on the table. Dylan watched her. Evelyn. She turned. He looked like he was trying to find a way to say something that didn't have a clear path out of him yet. His jaw worked once. Then he said very quietly, "Thank you." 2 words. No flourish. But the way he said them, careful and direct, the way he said everything, made her understand they cost him more than they looked. "Coffee first," she said. Then the boundary records. She went to put the coffee on and did not look at him again, because if she looked at him again right now, something would show on her face that she was not ready to have visible. The nights were the dangerous part. Not dangerous in any way she could have explained to someone who asked. Dylan McCall was nothing but proper. He kept his distance with a consistency that was almost formal. Gave her space in the house, the way you give space to someone you genuinely respect, and never once crossed any line she'd drawn consciously or unconsciously around herself. But the ranch was quiet at night, in a way that city life never was, and quiet had a way of letting things surface. She would sit after Samuel was down, and the work was done, and the lamp was low, and she would think about the correspondence notice she had answered on a cold afternoon in November when she had $40 left, and a son who needed boots, and a landlady who had started looking at her with the particular expression of a woman who was about to say something practical and unkind. She had answered it because there was no other option. She had told herself that. But sitting in Dylan McCall's kitchen with the lamp burning and the accounts in better shape than they'd been in years, and Rosie the gray mare outside, who had crossed the paddock to let a 4-year-old boy reach through the fence, sitting in that Evelyn Carter, was starting to wonder if option was the right word for what she'd done. She had chosen this, broke, frightened out of time, and running low on everything she had still chosen. This particular notice, this particular man, this particular broken-railed ranch in drought-cracked Texas. She had read Dylan McCall's letter 4 times before she replied. She had read the careful honesty in it, the unpretty directness of a man who wrote what he meant without decoration, and she had thought, this is someone who will not make me afraid. She had not been wrong, which was, it turned out, its own kind of terrifying. She heard his boots on the stairs, that deliberate, quiet tread, and then the floorboard outside her door, and then nothing. And she knew he'd seen the light under the door and was doing what she was doing, which was standing on his side of something and not crossing it. "Everything all right?" His voice muffled by the door. "Fine," she said. "Just finishing the water rights record." A pause. "It's late." "I know." She kept her voice steady. "Go to sleep, Mr. McCall." A longer pause. "Dylan," he said. She looked at the door. "If we're doing each other's accounts and fighting off land speculators," he said, and she could hear something in his voice that was almost dry. "You might as well use my first name." She breathed out slowly. "All right, go to sleep, Dylan." Another pause, and then his boots quiet down the hall. She sat for a long time after that, with the water rights record in her hands, and her heart doing something irrational, and she looked at the door and thought, "You're my first." She hadn't finished the sentence the day she arrived. Couldn't. The full sentence was something she had never said out loud, and was not sure she was ready to say yet, because saying it was a kind of admission that something had shifted inside her. Some arrangement she'd built to keep herself safe and functional, and shifts like that, once acknowledged, had a way of becoming undeniable. But sitting in the lamplight with the water rights record in her hands and the sound of Dylan McCall's boots fading down the hall, Evelyn Carter felt the sentence pressing against the inside of her ribs, patient and certain, waiting for the moment she was finally ready to let it out. "You're the first man I chose to walk toward." She set down the record, turned the lamp lower, sat in the dark, and thought about what it meant to choose something, really choose it, not survive into it, not fall into it, for lack of another option, but to look at a thing with clear eyes and say this: "I want this." And outside in the paddock in the dark, Rosie stood with her head raised, listening to something in the quiet night that no one else could hear. 22 days in the drought broke. Or rather, the sky threatened to break the drought, and on a ranch, the difference between threat and delivery was everything. The clouds came in from the northwest in the late afternoon, rolling and dark, and Dylan stood on the porch and looked at them with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Something that was part calculation and part something raw. Is it going to rain? Samuel asked from the porch rail, where he was balancing with his arms out. Don't know yet, Dylan said. Has it been a long time since it rained? Long enough. How long is enough? Dylan looked down at him. Longer than you've been alive, probably. Samuel considered this seriously. That's very long. Yes, it is. Evelyn stood beside Dylan, and they both looked at the clouds, and she said, If it does, what do you need to do first? And he told her. He talked about the water collection, and the cattle management, and the eastern field that had gone to hard pan, and what rain now would do to it, and whether it was too late to save any of the late grays. He talked the way he worked efficiently, specifically without performance, and she listened and asked the right questions and understood the answers, and somewhere in the middle of it, Dylan McCall stopped talking and looked at her in a way that was different from the measuring look. This look was something she didn't have a name for yet. You know cattle country, he said. I told you I was raised on a working property. Knowing it as a girl is different from understanding it now. She looked back at the clouds. My father talked to me like his foreman from the time I was 8. He didn't have a son. He didn't see the point in talking to me like I was only there to be decorative. A pause. I've never been sure if that was his respect for me or just his practicality. Does it matter which? She thought about it. No, she said. I don't suppose it does. The clouds thickened. The temperature dropped. Samuel came down from the porch rail and pressed against Evelyn's side, and she put her hand on the top of his head automatically, and Dylan looked at the two of them, and something happened in his face that he turned away too quickly for her to read. Get your rain gear, he said, just in case. She went inside to find it, and when she came back out, Dylan was still standing on the porch, looking at the sky, and he looked just for that moment, like a man who was allowing himself to want something. She did not say anything about it, but she stood beside him while the first drops fell slow and tentative at first, and then with a seriousness that made Dylan close his eyes just briefly. One long breath. Eyes closed, face turned slightly upward, and when he opened them, she was looking at the rain and pretending she hadn't seen it. Samuel let out a whoop and ran into the yard with his arms wide spinning in the drops, laughing the pure, uncomplicated laugh of someone who has not yet learned to be cautious about joy. Dylan watched him, and Evelyn watched Dylan watching him, and neither of them said a word about any of it. That night after Samuel was asleep, and the rain was steady on the roof, and the accounts were closed, and there was no more work to justify sitting up, Evelyn heard a sound from the front room and came out to find Dylan at the table with the letter in his hand. The one from the ledger. He'd unfolded it. He didn't hear her come in. He was reading it with his head bowed and his jaw set, and she could see even from across the room that his hand was not quite steady. She turned to go back. She would have liked the rain, he said. She stopped. Margaret. His voice was level, but only barely. She used to say that a ranch without rain is just a field with ambitions. He almost smiled. Almost. She had a way of saying things that stayed. Evelyn came back into the room and sat down at the other end of the table, not close, not intruding, just present. That's a good one, she said. She had hundreds of them. He set the letter down, folded it once. She would have sorted out Hargrove in a week. She'd have filed every legal challenge simultaneously and charmed the county clerk into processing them out of order and somehow made him think it was his idea. She sounds formidable. She was the most capable person I've ever known. He looked at his hands. Watching someone that capable become that sick, that fast, it changes what you believe about the fairness of things. Evelyn was quiet. I'm not asking for... He stopped. I'm not trying to... I know, she said gently. He looked up at her. You don't have to explain, she said. You're allowed to miss her. Something in his face, some rigid thing he'd been holding together, moved. Not broke, not dissolved, just moved like a door shifting in a wind. I gave all her things to her sister, he said. The clothes, the jewelry, the things she kept on the dresser. I gave them all away because having them here was I thought having them here was holding me in place. A pause. I kept the letters. Of course you did. I don't know why I'm telling you this. Because it's raining, Evelyn said. And the Hargrove men came today, and the rain is a lot, and the land company is a lot, and sometimes you just need the weight of the day to go somewhere. He was looking at her very steadily. Where does it go for you? He said. The question caught her off guard. Nobody had asked her that, and she could not remember the last time someone had asked her that. People asked her to manage things, carry things, solve things. Nobody asked where the weight went. I talked to Samuel, she said finally. Not about the real things, but about the small things, the things that happened in the day, and he tells me about the dog and what he thinks the clouds look like, and somehow She stopped. It makes the big things smaller, having someone who needs your voice. Dylan was quiet for a long time. He called me Uncle Dylan today, he said. She felt something catch in her chest. I'll talk to him. He doesn't know Don't. She stopped. Don't tell him not to, Dylan said. His voice was very quiet. I didn't mind it. The rain fell on the roof, steady and real and long overdue. Evelyn Carter sat across the table from Dylan McCall and did not say the sentence that was pushing against her ribs, because this was not the right moment, and she was a woman who had learned to wait for right moments with the patience of someone who had survived enough wrong ones. But for the first time, she believed the right moment might actually be coming, and that she understood was more hope than she had permitted herself in a very long time. Load later messages. The letter from Austin sat on the kitchen table for 2 days before Warren Hargrove found out about it. Evelyn didn't know how he found out. That was the part that kept her up the second night, not the fact of it, because a man with Hargrove's reach in a county this size would always find out, but the speed of it. Less than 48 hours between Dylan sending his response to Austin and the writer showing up at the ranch gate with a sealed envelope addressed in a hand that was too neat to be anything but legal. Dylan read it standing at the gate. She watched his face from the porch and couldn't read it at that distance, which told her the news was bad enough that he was controlling his expression deliberately. He folded the letter, put it in his pocket, paid the writer nothing because the writer hadn't waited for a tip, and walked back to the house with the particular measured stride of a man deciding how to say something. He put the letter on the table in front of her without a word. She read it. It was not from Hargrove directly. It was from a law firm in Dallas, 3 partners' names printed in heavy type at the top, and it informed Dylan McCall that Hargrove Land Corporation was initiating a formal legal challenge to the boundary correction filed at Calvary Creek County on the grounds that the original 1887 survey had been conducted by a licensed surveyor whose records superseded any subsequent clerical reinterpretation. It further noted that any correspondence with outside legal entities regarding this matter would be considered an escalatory action and responded to accordingly. She set the letter down. They moved faster than I expected, she said. So did we. Dylan pulled out the chair across from her and sat, which he still only did when something was serious enough to require stillness. They're not challenging the boundary. They're challenging the method. Saying your reinterpretation of the survey isn't legally equivalent to the original record. It's not a reinterpretation. The coordinate discrepancy is a mathematical fact. The 1887 surveyor recorded one number in his field notes and a different number was entered in the county ledger. That's either an error or it was done deliberately, and either way the field notes are the primary document. Do we have the field notes? She had been thinking about this since she read the letter's 3rd paragraph. The field notes would be in the surveyor's records. He's been dead for 20 years, but his son took over the business. He's in Abilene. Dylan looked at her. You already knew that. I looked it up when I found the discrepancy. I didn't write to him because I wasn't sure we'd need it. She paused. We need it. How long to get a response from Abilene? A week if he's cooperative. Longer if he needs convincing. Dylan's jaw worked once. And Hargrove's legal challenge gives them 60 days to file a full complaint, after which the boundary correction is frozen pending review. She kept her voice level because one of them needed to be level, And Dylan was doing that thing where he went very quiet in a way that had heat underneath it. 60 days is enough time if we move now. Write to the surveyor's son tonight, Dylan said. I'll write it now. She stood. He caught her wrist, not forcefully, just his hand closed around her wrist, and she stopped, and he said, Sit down for 1 minute. She sat. He was looking at her with an expression that had nothing to do with legal strategy. It was the expression she'd been careful not to look at directly for going on 6 weeks now, the one that lived underneath all the practical exchanges, the one that was becoming harder to pretend she hadn't noticed. You knew they'd come back with legal, he said. You had the surveyor's son's name before I knew we needed it. You wrote to Austin before I thought of it. He stopped. What else do you know that you're waiting to tell me? She held his gaze. Nothing I'm withholding. Some things I'm waiting until they're confirmed before I bring them forward. Tell me unconfirmed. She looked at his hand on her wrist. He followed her gaze and released her, but didn't move back. Hargrove's been acquiring drought properties at below-market rates by initiating legal clouds on titles right before sales close, she said. The sellers get scared of the legal cost, accept his offer to make it go away, and he gets the land for 60 cents on the dollar. He's done it at least 4 times in this county in the last 3 years. She paused. We're not the first ranch he's done this to. We're the first one that filed before he could. The silence that followed was a specific kind, the kind where a man is reconfiguring his understanding of a situation he thought he had figured out. How do you know this? Dylan said. I've been talking to people in town, the women at the dry goods store, the clerk's wife. People talk to women differently than they talk to men. They're less careful, less strategic. They say things as gossip that are actually intelligence. She watched his face. I know you didn't ask me to do that. No, he said. I didn't. A pause. Good thing one of us thought of it. She breathed out. Write the letter to Abilene, he said. Tonight. And write down everything you heard in town before you forget the specifics. Names, properties, dates if you have them. Already drafted. He stared at her. I drafted it last night, she said, when I couldn't sleep. Dylan McCall leaned back in his chair and looked at her with an expression that had moved fully past the measuring stage into something she genuinely did not have a safe category for. Evelyn, he said. I'll get the Abilene letter, she said, and stood before he could say whatever came after her name in that tone. She went to the study, stood with her back against the closed door for 10 seconds, then got the letter and went back to the table. The Abilene letter went out the next morning, and the waiting began, which was its own kind of pressure. Hargrove's people were visible in town in a way they hadn't been before, not at the ranch, not directly, but present in the peripheral way of men who want you to know they're watching without giving you anything specific to respond to. The feed store man mentioned carefully that someone had been asking about Dylan's credit history. The clerk's wife told Evelyn over the counter at the dry goods store that a man from the Dallas law firm had been in asking about the county's process for boundary challenge reviews. Evelyn thanked her, bought the flour she'd come for, and walked back to the wagon with her spine straight and her mind moving fast. Dylan was waiting with the horses. She climbed up and said, They're researching the review process. They want to know if they can slow it down. Can they? Depends on the county commissioner. Who appointed him? Dylan's expression shifted. Hargrove's brother-in-law nominated him 6 years ago. She turned to look at him fully. You didn't mention that. I didn't think it was relevant until now. It's relevant. She faced forward. It means we can't count on the county process being neutral. We need Austin to move faster than Hargrove can work the local system. And if Austin moves slow, then we find something Hargrove can't reach. She was thinking out loud now, the way she did when the problem was serious enough to push past her usual caution. The pattern of title clouds, if we can document 3 or 4 cases with enough specificity, that's not a boundary dispute anymore. That's a fraud complaint. Fraud goes to the state level, not county. Dylan was quiet for half a mile. Then, You're thinking about going around Hargrove's entire local operation. I'm thinking about building a case that makes the boundary dispute the smallest part of the problem he has. She paused. But it requires the other landowners to cooperate, to go on record. They won't, Dylan said flatly. He's already got them. That's why they sold. Maybe. She turned the problem over. Or maybe they sold because they thought they were alone. People make different decisions when they know someone else is standing with them. Dylan looked at her sideways. You want to organize them. I want to write them letters. A pause. That's the same thing. Is it something you'd object to? He didn't answer immediately, which meant he was actually considering it, rather than reflexively agreeing. She respected that about him. He didn't say yes to things just because she'd framed them reasonably. Some of those men are going to be ashamed, he said finally. Losing land to Hargrove's tactics men in this county don't talk about that. I know. She had thought about this too. The letters won't ask them to talk about shame. They'll ask them to talk about facts. Dates of contact terms, offered outcome. Factual record only. She paused. And I'll sign them myself. Not the ranch. Me. He looked at her sharply. Why? Because if this goes wrong, I don't want it to land on your operation. I'm ranch staff. I'm acting on my own initiative. If Hargrove pushes back on the letters, he's pushing back on a woman with a 4-year-old, which plays differently than pushing back on a rancher. Dylan pulled the horses to a stop. They were on an empty stretch of road, nothing around them, and he turned on the seat to face her with an expression that was not the measuring look or the unreadable layered look, but something rawer than either. No, he said. Dylan, you're not putting yourself between me and Hargrove and taking the risk on your own. It's a strategic. I don't care if it's strategically correct, he said, and his voice had an edge she hadn't heard in it before. Not anger exactly, but something adjacent to it. Something that came from a place he usually kept doors closed on. You're not doing that. She held his gaze. Why not? The question sat between them. He looked away, first out toward the road ahead, his jaw tight. Because you came here with one suitcase and one child, and you took a risk on a stranger's correspondence notice, and you've spent 6 weeks holding this ranch together, and I'm not going to let you absorb damage that belongs to me. The words came out flat and controlled, and she could hear underneath them exactly how much it had cost him to say them. She didn't say anything for a moment. All right, she said quietly. The letters go out under both our names. He looked back at her. Something in his face settled. All right, he said. He clicked the horses forward. Neither of them mentioned what had just happened in the particular way that people don't mention things that have shifted the ground between them. But the ground had shifted, and they both knew it. The reply from Abilene came 9 days later, and it was not what either of them had hoped for. Robert Casson, son of the original surveyor, wrote in a hand that was apologetic before the first sentence was finished. He confirmed that his father's field notes existed and were in his possession. He confirmed that the coordinate discrepancy Evelyn had identified was present in those notes. And then he wrote in careful and genuinely regretful language that he had received a visit 3 days ago from a representative of Hargrove Land Corporation who had informed him that any provision of those notes to parties adverse to Hargrove interests would result in a review of the licensing status of Casson Surveying, which was his only income and his family's livelihood. Dylan read the letter once and set it down without a word. Samuel was asleep. The house was quiet. Evelyn read it after him and set it down, and they sat across the table from each other in the kind of silence that comes after a door you needed closes. He got to him, Dylan said. Yes. Before our letter even arrived. He must have anticipated we'd look for the field notes after we filed the boundary correction. He got to Casson first. She kept her voice steady because Dylan's face was doing something complicated that she didn't want to tip over. He's thorough. He threatened a man's livelihood to suppress evidence. Dylan's voice was very flat. That's not thorough. That's criminal. It's criminal if we can prove it was suppression and not just a business conversation. She paused. But Casson told us about the visit. He didn't have to do that. Dylan looked at her. "He's asking for help without asking for help," she said. "He confirmed the notes exist, and he told us exactly why he can't provide them. That's a man who wants to cooperate, but needs something to protect himself first." She thought for a moment. If Austin's inquiry becomes official, if it's no longer McCall versus Hargrove, but a state-level investigation, Casson can provide the notes to investigators without it being an adverse action against Hargrove. He'd be responding to legal process, not choosing a side. The silence that followed was different from the previous one. This one had possibility in it. "We need Austin to move from preliminary inquiry to official investigation," Dylan said slowly, "which requires evidence of a broader pattern, which is what the letters to the other landowners are for." She looked at him. "It's all connected. Casson is the key to the boundary challenge. The boundary challenge is the key to Austin, and Austin is the key to protecting Casson. And all of it depends on whether the other landowners will go on record." "Yes." Dylan put his hands flat on the table, stared at them. "Two of those men, Aldridge and the Pierce brothers, they've got pride wound into this. Losing the land was bad enough. Admitting how it happened. I'll write to their wives," Evelyn said. Dylan looked up. "If the shame is the obstacle, go around it," she said. "The wives watched it happen too. They want it named as much as anyone. And women in this county have been invisible long enough that no one will see it coming." Something moved through Dylan's expression, something that in another man she might have called admiration. But in Dylan, it was quieter than that, more interior. He was looking at her the way people look at things that have surprised them past the point of ordinary surprise. "You think like a general," he said. "I think like a woman who's had to solve problems without being allowed to solve them directly." He was very still. "How long?" he said. Not what she expected. "How long what?" "How long did you have to live that way? Solving things from the side because the front was closed off?" She held his gaze. The question had the weight of the one he'd asked on the wagon. Who did you have to understand to stay safe? And she had deflected that one. And he hadn't pressed, and he wasn't pressing now, just asking, just leaving space. "Samuel's father," she said. 3 years. Before I left." The words fell into the silence and stayed there. Dylan didn't move. Didn't reach for her. Didn't recoil. Didn't do any of the things people do when they've been handed something they weren't sure they wanted. He just looked at her steadily with that dark, careful gaze and let what she'd said be what it was. Did he... He stopped. Started again more carefully. "Are you and Samuel safe from him now? He signed away his rights before Samuel was born. His family's money was contingent on it." She paused. "He didn't fight it. That told me everything I needed to know about how much I'd ever actually meant to him." "His loss," Dylan said, quietly, flatly, like a fact. She felt something move through her chest that she was not going to permit to show on her face. "Write the letters to the wives," she said. "Tonight." "Tonight," he agreed. But neither of them moved for another moment, and in that moment, the lamp burned between them, and the ranch was quiet outside, and Dylan McCall looked at Evelyn Carter with something on his face that he wasn't bothering to conceal anymore, and she looked back at him and did not look away. Then she pulled the paper toward her and started writing. The letters went to 6 women over the next 3 days. Evelyn wrote each one individually, not a form letter, not a template, but a specific letter to a specific woman whose name she'd learned from the dry goods store, and the church roster, and careful conversation. She named what she knew, without naming how she knew it. She asked for nothing except a record of what the women had seen. She signed her own name, and Dylan's beside it. The first reply came 4 days later, then 2 more on the same day. Then silence for a week that made her doubt everything. And then, on a Thursday afternoon, 3 letters arrived together from 3 different women, and all of them contained in different handwriting and different levels of detail. The same story, a man from Hargrove land, a number that was too low a legal letter that arrived within days and made the low number look like salvation. a sale that had happened before anyone understood they'd been maneuvered. Evelyn read all 3 letters at the kitchen table, and then she read them again, and then she went to find Dylan in the barn and said, "We have enough for Austin." He came out into the light and looked at her face. "How many?" 3 confirmed 2 more, who said they'd write again after talking to their husbands. And 1 Clara Aldridge, who said her husband wants to meet with you directly. Thomas Aldridge. Dylan's jaw worked. He hasn't spoken to me in 2 years. He thought I was going to blame him for selling. He thought everyone would blame him. Did you tell her? I told her there was nothing to blame. He was targeted by a man who does this for a living using methods that aren't obvious until you've seen them more than once. That's not weakness. That's information asymmetry. She paused. I may have used different words. Dylan almost smiled. Naturally. He'll come Thursday, she said. If you want him to. Tell him Thursday. She turned to go write the reply. Dylan said her name, and she turned back. He was standing in the barn doorway with the afternoon light behind him, and that expression on his face, the one she'd been not looking at directly for weeks now, and this time he didn't reach for something practical to say after it. This is going to work, he said. I know, she said. I didn't think it could. When the Dallas letter arrived, I thought... He stopped. I thought I was going to lose it. The ranch, the eastern quarter first, and then the pressure on the rest, until I had nothing worth keeping. He held her gaze. I didn't tell you that. I know you didn't. I should have. Dylan, I'm not good at telling people things are bad, he said. I'm better at fixing them. But you can't fix something if you don't know it's broken and you... He stopped again. You needed to know, so you could help. And I kept it to myself out of... He seemed to be deciding on the right word. Pride, which was stupid. She had never heard him describe himself as stupid before. It landed differently than she expected. You told me when it mattered, she said. That's what counts. I'm going to try to do it sooner going forward. Going forward. She felt those 2 words settle somewhere in her chest. All right, she said. He nodded once. She went to write the letter. Thomas Aldridge came on Thursday, and he was not what she'd expected from a man who'd lost 400 acres to Hargrove's methods and spent 2 years too ashamed to speak about it. He was smaller than she'd pictured, quieter, with the careful movements of someone who'd taken a hit that changed how he carried himself. He shook Dylan's hand at the door, and then he looked at Evelyn and said, My wife says you're the one who wrote to her. Yes, sir. She said you didn't make her feel stupid for not seeing it coming. She wasn't stupid. Nobody is the first time someone runs that play on them. Aldridge looked at her for a moment. Then he walked inside and sat down and said, Tell me what you need. What followed was 3 hours that felt like surgery. Careful, specific, occasionally painful, as Thomas Aldridge went through his memory of every contact Hargrove's people had made with him in the 6 months before the sale. The sequence, the timing of the legal letter, the exact wording of the offer. He remembered more than he thought he did, because the things that shame us tend to stay in detail even when we're trying not to look at them. Evelyn wrote everything down. Dylan asked questions. Aldridge answered them with a directness that had cost him something to arrive at. At the end of it, Aldridge looked at the pages Evelyn had filled and said, Is this enough? Combined with the other records, yes, she said. This establishes the method as deliberate and repeated. That's what elevates it from a dispute to a pattern. Aldridge was quiet. Then to Dylan, She's something. Yes, Dylan said without inflection. But he was looking at her when he said it. Aldridge left in the late afternoon, and Evelyn compiled the records, and Dylan sat beside her at the table, and they worked until the lamp burned low, and Samuel came in from the paddock with grass on his knees and Rosie's smell on his hands, chattering about something the mayor had done that morning. Dylan listened to him with the specific attention he gave things that mattered, and Samuel climbed onto the bench beside him and kept talking, and Evelyn looked at the 2 of them and felt something she had not permitted herself in a very long time. Hope. Not cautious, hedged, provisional hope. The real kind, the kind that commits. She turned back to the records before it showed on her face. The night everything broke open was not the night of the legal threat, though that came close. It was a Tuesday night, 3 weeks after Aldridge's visit, when the Austin office sent word that they had upgraded the McCall case to an official state-level inquiry based on the pattern documentation submitted. The same evening, a writer arrived from Hargrove's Dallas lawyers demanding a response to their original challenge within 72 hours, or they would file for an emergency injunction to freeze all land transfers pending their case. Dylan read both communications back to back at the kitchen table. Samuel was already in bed. The house was the way it got late at night, that particular quiet that had become over 2 months the most comfortable thing in Evelyn's life. She watched Dylan read the injunction threat and set it down. "They're trying to force a response before the state inquiry can get established," she said. "Yes. If we respond to their challenge directly, we're in their arena. If we forward the injunction threat to Austin as evidence of pressure tactics in an active state inquiry, we put them in ours." He looked up. "Can we do that?" "I already wrote the letter to Austin this afternoon when I heard about the inquiry upgrade. I just need your signature." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, "Evelyn, stop for a minute." She stopped. Not the strategy. He pushed the papers to one side. "Just stop for a minute." She put her hands flat on the table. "When did you last eat something?" he said. She had to think about it. "Breakfast. It's past 9. I know. You've been working since before I got up this morning. There was a lot to—" "I know there was." He stood and went to the stove, and she heard him moving things, heard the familiar sounds of the kitchen at work, and she sat very still and thought about the last time someone had noticed she hadn't eaten. She could not remember the last time. He set a plate in front of her. Bread and cold beef and a piece of the apple cake she'd made 2 days ago, and he sat back down across from her and said, "Eat." She looked at the plate. "Don't argue with me about it," he said. "I wasn't going to argue. You were thinking about it." She picked up the fork. He was right, and they both knew it, and somehow that was the funniest and most painful thing about it. She ate. He poured 2 cups of coffee and sat with his hands around his cup and watched her eat without making it strange. Just sat there, present in the way he was present, solid and unhurried. "I need to tell you something," he said when she was halfway through. She looked up. His face had the layered expression, the one she'd learned had multiple things happening simultaneously inside it. "The night you arrived," he said, you said those 3 words, and then you stopped." She went very still. "I've been thinking about them for 2 months," he said. "The sentence you didn't finish." "Dylan, I'm not asking you to finish it right now," he said. "I just want you to know that I've been thinking about it, because whatever the end of that sentence is, I think I know what it means, and I think I've known for a while." He looked at his coffee cup. "And I think you know that I know." The kitchen was so quiet she could hear the lamp. "Yes," she said. "I know." He looked up at her. "I'm scared of it," she said, because that was the truth, and he'd asked for truth the night he told her about Margaret's letters, and she owed him the same. "The last time I walked toward something without a plan to walk back, I got hurt. And Samuel got hurt. And I spent 3 years finding my way out." She held his gaze. "I'm not scared of you. I want to be clear about that. I'm scared of what I feel when I'm in this house with you and Samuel, and it starts to feel like home," he said. She stopped. "Like home," he said again quietly. She looked at him for a long time. "Yes," she said. He didn't move toward her. Didn't do anything sudden. Dylan McCall was not a man who did things suddenly. He just looked at her with that expression fully visible. No covering layer. Nothing held back or managed, and said, "You're allowed to let it." 3 words. 4 months ago, she had said 3 words that she couldn't finish. And now he had said 3 words that finished something she hadn't known she'd started, and they sat between them like something set down after a long carry. She did not cry. She was not a woman who cried easily. But her hands on the table were not quite steady, and she looked down at them, and then back up at him. And what was on her face, she didn't try to conceal. "I need to finish eating," she said. "I know," he said. "And sign the Austen letter." "I know." "And then—" She stopped. "And then," he said, and the way he said it, patient, certain, unhurried, told her that he understood. And then the same way she meant it as a door left open, that neither of them was going to rush through. But that was open now, and real, and not going to close again. She picked up her fork. He sat across from her and drank his coffee, and the lamp burned between them while outside in the dark, the drought-broken Texas land breathed slow and deep, and somewhere in the paddock, Rosie stood quiet under the stars, and the McCall ranch held its ground. She signed the Austen letter at 9:30, and Dylan signed it after her, and they sat for another hour, not talking about what had been said, and talking about everything else, which was its own kind of conversation, the kind that happens between people who have admitted something large and are giving it room to settle before they touch it again. He told her about the Eastern Field's recovery rate and what it would mean for the fall grays. She told him that the second Pierce brother had written back, and his letter contained 3 specific dates and dollar amounts that matched Aldridge's account almost exactly. He refilled her coffee without asking. She moved the lamp closer to the papers so he could see the figures without leaning. None of it was remarkable. All of it was. When she finally said goodnight and went upstairs, she stood in the dark of her room for a long time, listening to the sounds of the house settling, and Dylan moving below the particular quiet of a man going through his last tasks of the day. And she thought about 3 words. You're allowed to let it. She had been telling herself for 8 weeks that what she felt in this house was gratitude. Then she had told herself it was relief, the relief of safety after years without it of work that matched her capacity of a child who was flourishing. Both of those things were true. Neither of them was sufficient. She lay down and stared at the ceiling and thought, I have been here before. Not here exactly. Not in a good place. I have been in a place that felt necessary and then began to feel wanted. And I did not know the difference until the wanting became the thing that kept me somewhere I should have left. The difference, she told herself, is that Dylan McCall has never once made you feel like staying was required. Every morning for 8 weeks, she could have packed the worn suitcase. He would have paid her fairly for the time and helped her load the wagon and said goodbye with the same measured directness he said everything. She had stayed because she chose to. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, everything. She closed her eyes. Downstairs, the lamp went out. In the morning, nothing had changed, and everything had. Dylan was up before the sun as always. She heard his boots, heard the back door, gave him his 20 minutes, and then started breakfast. And when he came in from the first check, he sat at the table, and she put his plate down, and he said, "Thank you," the way he always did, and then he said, "Sleep all right," which he had never asked before. "Well enough," she said. "Good." He picked up his fork. "Samuel's going to want to check on Rosie before school." "He always does." "I told him yesterday I'd show him how to properly brush out her mane if he was careful about it. She'll let him if I'm there." She turned from the stove. "She's letting him closer. Every day a little." He set it to his plate, not to her, which was how he said things he meant most. She knows who's safe. Evelyn turned back to the stove before her face did anything that required explaining. The Austen letter went out with the morning rider, and by afternoon the 72-hour window on Hargrove's injunction threat had begun, and the pressure of it was a physical thing in the house, not spoken, not dramatized. Just present the way weather is present. Something you feel in your joints before it arrives. Dylan spent the afternoon on the eastern field with 2 of his ranch hands assessing the recovery in a way that was partly practical and partly, she understood, a man putting his hands on the thing he was fighting for. She did not begrudge him that. She sat with the full record she had assembled over 2 months. Boundary documents, survey correspondence. Casson's letter. The 6 women's accounts. Aldridge's testimony. The Pierce brothers' figures. the timeline of Hargrove's legal letters across 4 properties. And she read through it, the way you read something you've written before, presenting it to someone who will find every weakness. Because the Austin investigators would find every weakness, and she needed to find them first. She found 2. The first was a gap in the timeline, a 3-week period in which Hargrove's activity was documented by Aldridge but not corroborated by any second source. One person's account of timing was an allegation. 2 people's matching accounts were evidence. She needed someone else who could place Hargrove's representative in Calvary Creek County during those 3 weeks. The second was Casson. Without the surveyor's field notes, the boundary challenge remained legally uncertain, regardless of the pattern documentation. The state inquiry could establish fraud, but the original boundary dispute, the thing that had started all of this, still rested on a coordinate discrepancy that Hargrove's lawyers were calling a clerical reinterpretation. She was still working through the problem when Samuel came in from the paddock with grass on his boots and his hair wild and a look of profound satisfaction on his face. "She let me do the whole left side," he announced. "Rosie. Dylan said I have good hands." He said it with the seriousness of a man who has received a professional commendation. He said not everybody does. "He's right," she said. "Not everybody does." Samuel climbed onto the bench and looked at her papers. "Are those the bad man's papers?" She had not told him about Hargrove in any detail. Children absorbed more than anyone intended. "They're papers about the ranch," she said carefully. "Dylan said the bad man wants to take the ranch." She looked at him. He said there was a man who wanted land that didn't belong to him, and that we were going to make sure he didn't get it." Samuel paused. He said we. She set her pen down. "We." Dylan McCall, who had lived alone for 4 years and kept 1 cup on the drying rack and 2 chairs pushed to the wall, had said we to a 4-year-old boy about the ranch he'd been fighting to keep. She picked her pen back up. Did he say anything else? He said Rosie trusts me now, and that trust is hard to get and easy to lose, and I should take care of it. Samuel considered. I think he was talking about more than Rosie. She looked at her son, 4 years old. The frightening clarity of small people who haven't yet learned to look away from what's true. "Go wash the paddock off your hands," she said. "Then come help me set the table." "Okay." He slid off the bench. Stopped. "Mama." "Yes." "I like it here." She held his gaze. He looked back at her with those dark eyes that trusted her completely, and she felt the weight of that trust the way she always did, as the most serious thing she carried. "I like it here too," she said. He went to wash his hands, and she turned back to the record and the second problem, Casson. The field notes, the thing Hargrove had successfully blocked, was still sitting there unsolved when Dylan came in for supper. She told him over the meal. Both gaps clearly, and without softening them, because he'd asked her not to manage what she told him, and she was honoring that. He listened without interrupting, which was how he listened to everything. When she finished, he said, "The 3-week gap. Clara Aldridge's letter. She mentioned a man coming by twice in October. Does October overlap?" Evelyn pulled the timeline from the stack, checked it, felt something click. Yes, 2 weeks of overlap. Clara named the man. A first name. Carl. Carl Denny. He's Hargrove's primary field representative for this county. He's the one who came to my gate the first time. Dylan's voice was level. If Clara can state in writing that Carl Denny visited the Aldridge property in October, and I can state he visited this property in October, that closes the gap. She was already reaching for paper. "I'll write to Clara tonight." "Second problem," he said. She put the paper down. "Casson." "Yes." They looked at each other. "I've been thinking about it all afternoon," she said. "The only thing that protects Casson from Hargrove's licensing threat is if Casson isn't choosing a side if he's responding to a legal requirement rather than a voluntary decision. But we can't compel his testimony. We're not law enforcement." "No," Dylan said. "But Austin is." She stared at him. If the state inquiry issues a formal document request, Dylan said slowly, working it through as he spoke, Casson has legal protection. He's not providing the notes voluntarily. He's complying with a state order. Hargrove can't call that an adverse action against his interests. We need Austin to know the notes exist and to include them in a formal document request. We need to tell Austin about Casson's letter. She had not put Cassine's letter in the Austin package. She had judged it too uncertain, too potentially damaging to a man who'd already been threatened. She looked at the letter now sitting in its folder and recalculated. If I include it, she said, I need to frame it correctly. Not as evidence of Hargrove's intimidation that's useful later, but as notice that a primary source document exists and may require formal process to access. I keep Casson's name out of the narrative description and let Austin request the records as part of their standard inquiry process. Can you write it that way? Yes. She pulled the folder toward her. It'll take me an hour. Write it. I'll do the dishes. She looked up. In 10 weeks, Dylan McCall had never offered to do the dishes. He did many things, fixed things, checked things, managed the 10,000 physical demands of a working ranch. But the domestic interior of the house had fallen to her by unspoken arrangement and had stayed there. He was already at the basin. She watched his back for exactly 2 seconds, and then looked down at the letter and began to write. The 72 hours expired on a Thursday morning, and Hargrove's lawyers filed the injunction. The county clerk sent word by noon. Dylan took the notice from the rider at the gate and read it and came inside and set it on the table and said, It's filed. Expected, Evelyn said. She was already at the desk. Our response goes to Austin today, along with the Casson addendum and Clara Aldridge's corroboration of the October timeline. Can Austin respond before the injunction hearing? The hearing is in 14 days. Austin has been moving. They've already upgraded twice. If they issue the document request to Cassine in the next week, we can have the field notes authenticated before the hearing. That's tight. Yes. She looked at him. But we have the full pattern documentation, 5 corroborating accounts the timeline closed, and a state inquiry already on record. Hargrove's injunction is trying to freeze a situation that has already moved past him. The judge at the hearing will see that. Dylan stood very still in the way he did when he was deciding something at a fundamental level. What aren't you saying? She asked. He looked at her. The county judge who will hear the injunction was appointed 6 years ago. She absorbed this. Hargrove's brother-in-law nominated him. Yes. The silence was heavy. Then we need to request a change of venue, she said, on the grounds that the county commissioner who appointed the judge has a documented conflict of interest as a Hargrove Land Corporation associate. She paused. I'll add it to today's package to Austin and let them advise. If we request a venue change, Hargrove knows we know about the judge. He already knows we know about the boundary discrepancy, the pattern, the other landowners, and Casson. At this point, letting him know we know about the judge tells him something more important. What? That we've been watching everything. Not just the obvious things. She held his gaze. Men like Hargrove are organized around the assumption that the person across from them doesn't see the whole board. The moment they understand, you do the calculation changes. Dylan was very quiet. You're not just trying to win the case, he said. You're trying to make him decide it costs too much to continue. Yes, because even if we win the hearing, he can appeal, and appeal costs money and time we don't have indefinitely. Yes. So you want him to look at the full picture and choose to stop. I want him to understand that we will go to every level this has for as long as it takes, and that every step he takes to escalate gives us more material for the state case. She set her pen down. The strongest position isn't winning the battle he's chosen. It's making him regret choosing it. Dylan looked at her for a long moment. Then he walked to the desk and stood beside her and looked at the document she was drafting and said, What do you need me to do? Sit down with me and tell me every interaction this ranch has ever had with anyone connected to Hargrove land, going back to when you first heard his name. He pulled up the second chair, the one that had been pushed to the wall when she arrived. He sat down, and they worked. Keen. The twist came from the direction nobody was watching. 4 days after the injunction filing, Ruth arrived again, not by buggy this time on horseback, which meant urgency, and she came through the front door without knocking, and found Evelyn at the table, and said without preamble, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to tell Dylan carefully." Evelyn stood. "What happened?" "Nothing yet, but it will." Ruth took off her hat. Her hands were not quite steady. "I was in Abilene last week, visiting a friend. I ran into Robert Casson at the post office." Evelyn went still. "He didn't know who I was," Ruth said. "I introduced myself as a rancher's sister-in-law from Calvary Creek, and he was agitated, I could see it, and he started talking. The way people talk when they've been holding something too long." She sat down across from Evelyn. "He said Hargrove's man came back. Not once. 3 times in 2 weeks. The last time he was told that if the state inquiry issued a document request for his father's field notes, and if those notes found their way into evidence, Hargrove would not stop at the licensing review. He would find something." "Find something," Evelyn repeated. "Those were his words. Find something. Casson doesn't have anything to find. I don't think he's done anything wrong in his life. But that's not the point. The threat is the point. They're threatening to manufacture something if he cooperates with an official process." The implications landed one after another like stones into deep water. "That's witness intimidation," Evelyn said, "in an active state inquiry." "Yes. If Cassin will document those visits, the date's what was said. That's what I'm here to tell you." Ruth leaned forward. "He wants to. He's frightened, but he's angry too, and the anger is winning. He said if someone could tell him that his documentation of the threats would be protected as part of the state inquiry, that he'd be a protected party, not just a witness, he would provide everything." Evelyn was already at the desk. "When did you get back from Abilene?" she asked. "Yesterday evening." "You came here first thing this morning." "Obviously." She was writing as she spoke. "If Casson documents the intimidation and submits it directly to Austin as a protected party complaint, he's not just a witness anymore. He's a complainant. The state has a legal obligation to protect him." She looked up. "And Hargrove has just handed us the most valuable piece of evidence in the entire case, documented intimidation of a witness in an active state fraud inquiry." Ruth watched her write. "You're not surprised by any of this." "I'm surprised by the timing, not the behavior." She kept writing. "Hargrove has been running the same method for years. When it stops working, he applies more pressure. He doesn't know how to do anything else." She sealed the letter. "Can you get back to Abilene this week?" "I can go tomorrow. Take this to Casson. It explains his status as a protected complainant and what he needs to document. Tell him to submit it directly to the Austin Inquiry Office, not through us directly. His own letter, his own words, his own name." She paused. "Tell him he won't be alone in this." Ruth took the letter, looked at Evelyn with Margaret's dark eyes. "Dylan is lucky you answered that notice. I'm lucky he wrote it." Ruth stood. "Where is he?" "Eastern Field. I'll stop on my way out. He needs to hear this from you, not me, but I want to see his face when you tell him." She left. Evelyn sat at the desk for a moment with her hands flat on the surface, feeling the shape of what had just shifted. Casson's testimony, plus the intimidation documentation, plus the pattern evidence, plus the 5 corroborating landowner accounts, plus the venue challenge, plus Austin's existing inquiry. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was the kind of case that didn't go away when one hearing went wrong because it existed on too many levels simultaneously for any single judge or commissioner to contain. She heard Ruth's horse in the yard, and then Dylan's voice low and too far away to make out words, and then boots on the porch, fast, deliberate, different from the usual pace. He came through the door and looked at her. "Ruth told me," he said, "some of it. Casson is going to submit a protected party complaint to Austin, directly. If he does it this week, it's on record before the injunction hearing." She stood. "It changes the entire posture of the case. Hargrove isn't just a land dispute anymore. He's a subject of a state fraud inquiry who has been documented intimidating a witness. No reputable attorney in Texas is going to let him push that injunction forward. Dylan crossed the room and he stopped in front of her, and he was closer than he usually stood, and she looked up at him, and his face had the layered expression, but stripped of every covering. Nothing managed, nothing held behind the door. "It's going to hold," he said, not a question. "Yes," she said. "The ranch is going to hold." He looked at her for a long moment, the kind of moment that has weight. Then he said very quietly, "I'm not just talking about the ranch." She held his gaze. "I know," she said. He raised his hand and touched her face, just the side of his hand against her cheek, brief and careful. The touch of a man who has thought about this for a long time and is doing it right. And she didn't move away, and he didn't rush. And the distance between them closed, the way things close when they've been moving toward each other for longer than either person admitted. The kiss was not accidental. It was not restrained or cautious or practical. It was the kind that comes after months of choosing not to, and it carried all of that in it, all the measured evenings, and the careful distances, and the working side by side without touching. And when he pulled back and looked at her, she could see that it had undone something in him that he had been holding together for 4 years. She put her hand flat against his chest, felt his heart, not steady, not the controlled pace of a man who had things arranged, fast, real. "Samuel's going to be home in an hour," she said. "I know. I know." He didn't step back. "Evelyn." "Yes. I need to say something, and I'm going to say it badly, so I need you to hear what I mean, and not just what I say." She waited. "I don't know how to do this," he said. "I did it once and I knew how because we grew into it over years, and I didn't have to. There wasn't a moment where I had to choose it, it just accumulated." He stopped, tried again. "With you, it's different. It's been a choice every day for 10 weeks. Every morning I chose to let you stay. Not because you were useful though you are, but because when I walked into this house in the morning and you were here, something that had been quiet in me for 4 years was not quiet." She couldn't speak. "I don't know if that's the right thing to say," he said. "It's the right thing," she said. "It's the exact right thing." He exhaled, like he'd been holding that for a very long time. "I'm not good at fast," he said. "I'm not asking for fast. I'm asking you to not leave, to stop thinking of this as temporary." He looked at her steadily. "Whatever that means going forward, whatever shape that takes, I'm asking you to stop planning your way out." She thought about the worn suitcase upstairs, about $40 and Samuel's boots and a correspondence notice and the terrifying mathematics of last options. She thought about what it meant to choose something, really choose it, not survive into it. "I stopped planning my way out 6 weeks ago," she said. "I just wasn't ready to say it." Something moved through his face. Relief, she thought, though, on Dylan. McCall, it was quieter than that. More like a man setting down something he'd been carrying at an angle that hurt. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. He stepped back, gave her room. The way he'd always given her room, not distance, just space, the kind that said, "You don't have to earn your place here." "I'll go check the water barrel before Samuel gets home," he said. "He'll want to tell you about school." "I know." He picked up his hat, stopped at the door. "The apple cake from yesterday, is there any left?" He half. "Good." He put his hat on. "He'll want some." He went out. She stood in the middle of the kitchen and pressed her fingers to her mouth and felt the shape of what had just happened. Not the kiss, not even the words, but the we of it. The accumulating, undeniable we of two people who had spent 10 weeks being careful with each other and had finally, at the same moment, decided to stop. She went to the desk, picked up her pen. The Austin letter needed one more paragraph. She'd thought of it while Dylan was talking, the particular legal framing that would position Cassine's protected complaint as the cornerstone of the state's escalation path, and she wrote it cleanly, with the settled focus of a woman who has put something down and has both hands free. Outside, she heard Samuel before she saw him, his voice carrying across the yard calling for Dylan. the high, clear sound of a child who expects to be heard and answered. And Dylan's voice, lower, answering. And Samuel's laugh. She finished the paragraph, signed her name, set the pen down, and sat for a moment in the sound of the two of them outside, the man and the boy, the horse and the barn, and the drought-broken land, and let herself feel, without hedging or qualifying or planning the way back out, exactly what she felt. She let it be home. And it was. The Austin letter went out on a Friday. By Monday, Robert Casson had submitted his protected party complaint directly to the state inquiry office, and by Wednesday, the inquiry had been upgraded for the third time. No longer a preliminary investigation, no longer a pattern review, but a formal state fraud proceeding against Hargrove Land Corporation with subpoena authority and document compulsion power. Evelyn found out from the Austin office's wire, which arrived Thursday morning, while Dylan was in the far field and Samuel was at school. She read it 3 times, standing at the kitchen table, and then she sat down because her legs decided they were done holding her up. It was real. It had worked. She was still sitting there when Dylan came in 20 minutes later, and he looked at her face and stopped in the doorway. What happened? She held up the wire. He crossed the room and took it and read it, and she watched his face, watched the careful, controlled surface of it, absorb what the words said, and saw the moment it arrived. Not dramatics, not a shout, just a long exhale through his nose, and his hand dropping to the table, and his eyes closing for exactly 3 seconds. Then he opened them and looked at her. "Casson's protected," he said. "Fully. The moment he submitted as a complainant, the state assumed legal responsibility for his status. Hargrove can't touch him without adding obstruction of a formal state proceeding to everything else. And the injunction hearing is still on calendar for next Tuesday. But Hargrove's Dallas lawyers have known about the fraud proceeding since yesterday. They're not going to walk a client into an injunction hearing in front of a county judge while a state fraud case is active against that same client." She paused. "It would be professional malpractice." Dylan set the wire down. "They'll withdraw it. Or ask for a continuance to create distance. Either way, the hearing is not going to go the way Hargrove planned it." He looked at her for a long moment. "You knew this was the sequence when you wrote to Austin the first time." "I thought it could be. I wasn't certain until Casson." "You built it from the beginning. The boundary, filing the pattern documentation, the landowners, Casson, the protected complaint, it was one structure. It had to be. Hargrove's operation is layered. You can't dismantle it at one level. You have to make every level unstable simultaneously." She paused. "I learned that from him, actually. He uses the same principle to trap people. I just applied it in reverse." Dylan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I want to ask you something." "All right. When you answered the correspondence notice, when you wrote that first letter, did you know this was in you? This capacity?" She thought about it honestly. "I knew I was capable. I didn't know I'd have room to use it." She looked at her hands on the table. "The last place I lived, being capable was a problem. It made someone feel reduced. So I made myself smaller, did less, hid what I could do behind what I was allowed to do." She looked up at him. "The first week I was here, I waited for you to tell me I'd overstepped. When you didn't, I went one step further, and then another, and you just kept not stopping me." "Why would I stop you?" "Most men would have." "I'm not most men," he said, not with pride. Just as a statement of fact, the way he said everything true. "No," she said, "you're not." He picked up the wire again. "Read it once more." Set it down with a finality that meant he was done needing to reread it. "I'm going to go tell the hands," he said. "They've been watching this build for 2 months. They deserve to know. Tell them Casson's protected too. Carl Denny Hargrove's fieldman came to at least one of their families in the county." Dylan's jaw tightened. "I'll tell them." He went out. She heard him cross the yard, heard his voice carried toward the barn. Not the words, just the tone, the particular level note of a man delivering good news without performance, and she heard the hand's response louder and less contained than Dylan's, the natural release of people who'd been tensed for weeks. She put the wire in the documentation folder, labeled it, filed it in sequence. Then she sat at the table with her hands folded and let herself feel the full weight of what had been built and what it had taken to build it. And she thought about a woman in San Antonio with $40 and a child and a worn suitcase reading a letter for the fourth time and thinking, this man tells the truth. I can work with truth. She had been more right than she knew. Haig. The withdrawal came on Saturday, not a concession. Hargrove's lawyers were too practiced for concessions, but a filing requesting an indefinite continuance of the injunction hearing, pending resolution of related proceedings at the state level. The county clerk sent word by writer. Dylan read the notice at the gate and paid the writer $1 because some news deserves $1. He brought it inside and put it on the table and said, "It's over. The injunction is over," she said. "The state proceeding continues." "I know, but the ranch is safe." She looked at him. "The ranch is safe, Dylan." He sat down. The chair scraped back, and he sat with his elbows on the table and his face in his hands for a moment, just a moment, and she did not look away, and did not pretend not to see it, because he had earned the right to feel this without an audience managing their eyes. When he looked up, his face was composed, but the composure was the kind that comes after something has moved through a person, rather than the kind that keeps things from moving at all. 4 years, he said. I've been holding this place together for 4 years. After Margaret. Through the drought. Watching neighbors sell. He stopped. There were nights I thought I was going to lose it anyway. That all the holding on was just... He searched for the word. Delay, she said quietly. Yes? He looked at her. And then you came through that door with one suitcase and said 3 words and couldn't finish them, and 10 weeks later I'm sitting here because you built a legal case that stopped Warren Hargrove. She held his gaze. We built it. You built it. I signed things. You gave me room to build it. That's not nothing. That's everything. She paused. Most people don't know how to give room. They think it's passive. It's not. It's an active decision every day to let someone be what they are. He was looking at her with that expression, the one that had nothing managed in it. You're going to make me say something I'm not ready to say in the right way yet, he said. Then don't say it yet, she said. We have time. We have time. 2 months ago, she could not have said those words and meant them. Now they came out of her as naturally as breathing, because they were true, because she had stopped planning the exit and started living in the fact of being here. And the difference between those two things was the difference between surviving and being alive. Samuel gets home in an hour, she said. I know. He didn't move. He's going to want to celebrate somehow. He doesn't know the details, but he knows something big was happening, and he's been watching our faces for days. What does a 4-year-old's celebration look like? Based on precedent, it involves the dog Rosie and the apple cake in some combination. Dylan almost smiled. Almost, and then all the way, and it was the kind of smile that arrived slowly and stayed, the kind that changed his whole face into something she hadn't seen enough of and intended to see much more of going forward. I'll make sure there's cake, he said. There's already cake. I made it yesterday. He looked at her. I knew the withdrawal was coming, she said. I wanted to be ready. He shook his head slowly, not disbelief. Something warmer. You made a celebration cake before the thing was certain. I made a cake for when it became certain. There's a difference. What's the difference? Confidence, she said. Versus hope. He was quiet for a moment. Which was it? She thought about it. Both, she said. At the same time, I've been learning to let them coexist. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. Not dramatically, not with a speech, just his hand on hers, warm and certain, and still, the way he was still, not because nothing was happening inside him, but because everything happening inside him was real enough not to need performance. She turned her hand over under his. They sat like that until they heard Samuel coming up the road hollering before he was through the gate, and Dylan stood and went to meet him, and she watched through the window as the boy ran at him, and Dylan caught him, without hesitation, lifted him the way he'd been lifting him for weeks now. Easy, natural, like it had always been this way. And Samuel's voice carried through the glass, though she couldn't make out the words, and Dylan's answer was low, and she saw Samuel's face change as the answer reached him. He looked toward the house. He looked back at Dylan. He said something very serious, and Dylan answered, and then Samuel did the thing he did when he was feeling something too big for his body. He pressed his face against Dylan's shoulder for a moment, just a moment, and then pulled back and started talking fast. The flood of words that meant relief had become excitement. She went to get the cake. The celebration was exactly what she'd predicted. The dog got involved. Rosie got a visit, and the cake was consumed with an enthusiasm that suggested Samuel had been anticipating it all week. Dylan ate 2 pieces, which was the most remarkable thing she'd witnessed in 10 weeks of remarkable things. And when Samuel finally ran down and fell asleep on the bench by the hearth between the dog's front paws, the house went quiet, in the way it did late at night, settled and real. Dylan poured 2 cups of coffee. They sat across from each other like they had 100 times, except nothing was the same as it had been the first time. "I need to tell you about the agreement," Dylan said. She looked up. The correspondence arrangement, the formal terms. He held his cup. The wage, the room and board. It was a 6-month trial. She had known this. She'd read the original notice carefully. 6-month terms to be renegotiated or concluded at the end of the period. "We're at 10 weeks, she said. "Yes." He set his cup down. "I want to renegotiate the terms." She waited. "The wage stays. The room stays." He looked at her directly. "The temporary part ends." She held his gaze. "Dylan, I'm not asking you to decide anything tonight," he said. "I know this is fast by any reasonable measure, and I know what you came from, and I know that words aren't the same as time." He paused. "But I'm asking you to know that the offer is on the table, not provisional, not contingent, permanent." His jaw moved once. "You and Samuel. This is your home if you want it." The lamp burned between them. She thought about the night she'd arrived, the door opening, and the man who looked like he was thinking, rather than angry, and the 3 words that fell out of her before she could choose them. She had been so ashamed of those 3 words. She had spent the first week wishing she could take them back. "You're my first," she said. He went still. "The full sentence." She looked at him steadily. "The one I couldn't finish the day I arrived. You're the first man I chose to walk toward. Not fell into, not survived into, not accepted, because there was no other option." She felt her voice do something she pressed down firmly. "I chose your letter. Out of every other option I had that day, and I had some they weren't good, but I had them, I chose yours, because you wrote like someone I could trust. And I was right." He was very still. "I don't need time," she said. "I've been certain for 6 weeks. I've just been making sure I was certain for the right reasons." "Are you?" "Yes." He exhaled slowly. "What are the right reasons? You let me be capable. You gave Samuel a place to belong without requiring anything in return. You told me the truth even when it was incomplete, and you let me tell you things that were hard, and you didn't use them." She paused. "And you make coffee the right way, which is more important than people acknowledge." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said with the dry precision she had come to love, "I'll make sure the coffee stays up to standard." "See that you do." His hand came across the table again, and this time he didn't let go immediately, and she didn't pull away. And the quiet house held them, and the sleeping boy, and the last of the lamplight, and outside the drought-broken land breathed slow under a sky full of Texas stars. The state fraud proceeding against Hargrove Land Corporation took 11 months to resolve. Evelyn tracked every filing. Austin's investigators pulled Casson's field notes under formal subpoena, confirmed the coordinate discrepancy was original and deliberate, and expanded the inquiry to include 7 properties in 3 counties. Carl Denny cooperated with investigators in exchange for reduced liability, and provided documentation of Hargrove's instructions that went back 6 years. Thomas Aldridge and the Pierce brothers submitted formal depositions. Clara Aldridge's account of the October visits became Exhibit 37, in a case that eventually ran to over 200 exhibits. Warren Hargrove settled. Not in court. Men like Hargrove do not go to court when the alternative exists, but in a settlement that required the return of 2 improperly acquired properties, the payment of significant penalties, and the permanent dissolution of Hargrove Land Corporation's Texas operations. The county commissioner who had nominated the Hargrove-connected judge resigned 6 weeks before the settlement, citing personal reasons, which was the county's polite language for what everyone understood had occurred. Dillon read the settlement notice at the kitchen table with his second cup of morning coffee and set it down and said, "It's done." "It's done," she said. He looked up. "All of it." "All of it." He nodded once, the way he acknowledged things that were complete. Then he picked up his coffee and drank it and said, "The eastern field is ready for fall grazing. I want to walk it this afternoon." "I'll come," she said. "I know," he said. "I was going to ask." What happened between then and the following spring is best understood not in events but in accumulation. The second chair stayed at the table. The lamp stayed lit later than it used to. Ruth came for dinner on the first Sunday of every month and argued cheerfully with Evelyn about cooking methods and told Samuel stories about Margaret that made the boy listen with the solemn attention he gave things he understood mattered. Rosie let Samuel brush both sides without supervision by December. By February, she would come to the fence when she heard his voice. Dillon said the things he meant to say with increasing frequency and decreasing difficulty, which was not a transformation, but a practice, the daily work of a man learning to open doors he'd kept closed so long he'd forgotten they were doors. Evelyn stopped making plans to leave. Not as a decision, not as a dramatic internal moment, but as a gradual absence, the way pain recedes when the thing causing it is gone, and you only notice, because one day you realize you can't remember when you stopped bracing for it. Samuel called Dillon by his first name for the first month, and then for reasons that were never fully explained. He began calling him something else. Not a title, not a formal word. Something softer, something that came from the private vocabulary of children who have decided a person belongs to them, and Dillon. The first time he heard it stopped what he was doing, and stood very still for a moment, and then continued what he was doing, and did not correct it. He did not correct it the second time either, or the third. The morning Dillon asked Evelyn to marry him was not a grand morning. It was a Tuesday in March before the sun was fully up, and he came in from the first check, and she put his coffee down, and he picked it up and said without sitting down, without preamble, without any of the dramatic architecture she might have expected from a different kind of man, "I'd like you to be my wife." She looked at him. "I've been thinking about how to say it properly for 2 months," he said. "I couldn't find a better way than that." "That's the best way," she said. "Is that a yes?" "Yes," she said. "That's a yes." He put the coffee down, crossed the kitchen, put his hands on either side of her face the way he had the first time, careful and certain, and kissed her the way he'd kissed her that afternoon 4 months ago, without performance, without rush, like a man who has decided and is no longer in any doubt about the decision. When he pulled back, she put her forehead against his jaw, and they stood like that for a moment, while the kitchen filled with early light. "Samuel's going to want a role in this," she said. "I already asked him," Dillon said. She pulled back and looked at him. "Yesterday," Dillon said with the absolute composure of a man who understands priorities. "I asked him first. He said yes, provided he could keep his room and the dog was also allowed to stay." She stared at him. "You asked my 4-year-old son for permission before you asked me." He was the first one I was sure would say yes. She laughed. She hadn't expected to laugh, and the laugh surprised both of them, and Dillon's expression did the thing it did when something pleased him deeply. Not a large expression, just a slight opening, a warmth the face of a man who has found something he did not believe he'd find again. "The dog stays," she said, obviously. Obviously. He agreed. They were married in June in the yard of the McCall Ranch, with Ruth standing on Evelyn's side and two of Dylan's hands on his, and Samuel in a clean shirt that he'd agreed to wear under protest and had stopped minding about 20 minutes in. The minister was brief. Dylan said what he meant the way he always did, with no extra words and nothing missing. Evelyn said what she'd been saying to herself for months and had been waiting for the right moment to say out loud. Thomas Aldridge came with his wife. The Pierce brothers came. Clara Aldridge brought a pie. Robert Casson sent a letter from Abilene that made Evelyn read it twice and hand it to Dylan without comment, and Dylan read it and folded it carefully and put it in his shirt pocket. In the evening, when the guests had gone and Samuel had fallen asleep on the bench in the way he always did when the day was bigger than his capacity to stay awake through it, Dylan and Evelyn stood together on the porch in the dark, and the June air came across the recovered land with the smell of things growing, and Calvary Creek County lay quiet around them. "You're not temporary anymore," Dylan said. "I haven't been for a long time," she said. He put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and they stood like that two people who had come to each other broken and had not fixed each other, had instead built something new from what remained, which is harder than fixing and more durable. And the ranch held its ground around them, the way it had held it through drought and threat and loss and the long work of starting over. Samuel sighed in his sleep inside the house. Rosie moved in the paddock, a soft sound, a known sound. Dylan pressed his mouth to the top of Evelyn's head, brief and quiet. She thought about the worn suitcase. $40. A letter read 4 times. 3 words that came out wrong and changed everything. "You're my first." Not just the first man she'd chosen. He was the first place she'd ever stood where the ground felt permanent. The first morning she'd woken up without calculating the cost of staying. The first person who had looked at the full measure of what she was capable, scarred, stubborn, precise, and said, "Good. I needed exactly that." And Dylan standing in the dark with his wife beside him, and a boy asleep inside, and a ranch that had outlasted every attempt to take it, Dylan thought about 4 years of silence, and 1 letter, and a woman who couldn't finish a sentence, and then spent 10 weeks proving she could finish everything. He had spent 4 years believing that what he'd lost was irreplaceable. He understood now that he had been asking the wrong question. The question was never whether she could be replaced. The question was whether he would ever stop being someone who could love a person that fully. He had his answer. Some people don't replace your past. They walk into your future and stand there so solidly that the future becomes the place you live, and the past becomes the country you came from. Real, honored, grieved, and no longer the only story you have to tell. Dylan McCall had believed for 4 long years that his story was finished. Evelyn Carter had walked through his door with 1 suitcase and 3 unfinished words, and proved him wrong in the best possible way, not by erasing what came before, but by making what came next worth staying alive for. And on a June night in Texas, with the recovered land breathing around them, and the stars doing what stars do over people who have finally improbably found their way home, that was exactly enough. That was everything.